The 1889 sister portrait appeared ordinary until historians noticed a dark secret hidden within. The auction house on Newbury Street smelled of aged wood, of lives quietly forgotten. Emma Hartford moved through the dim room with practiced eyes, her fingers brushing over Victorian furniture, tarnished silver, and the dust of decades. As a historical artifacts appraiser, she had learned to look past decay and see the stories beneath. But nothing could have prepared her for what awaited on that cold February morning in 2024. The portrait leaned against a mahogany dresser almost lost among the clutter of the estate sale. Two young women stared out from the sepia-toned photograph, their faces rigid in that formal Victorian style, unsmiling restrained. In the corner, the photographer's stamp read Crawford Studios, Boston, March 1889. Emma nearly walked past it, nearly. But something made her pause. Maybe it was the way her sister's hand clenched on her thigh, the knuckles white, even in the faded photo. Or perhaps it was the younger sister's eyes, wide and dilated, as if she had glimpsed something terrible just before the shutter clicked. Emma lifted the frame carefully, wiping away 135 years of grime with her sleeve. And then she saw it. Behind the two sisters hung an ornate oval mirror, its gilded frame barely visible in the background. Emma squinted, then pulled out her phone, zooming in on the reflection. And her breath caught. In the mirror, partially obscured but unmistakably present, was the silhouette of a man standing behind where the photographer would have been. In his hand, angled strangely, was something that caught the light, a thin, pointed object. Emma's pulse quickened. She drew the portrait closer, studying the sisters' faces again with a new understanding. It wasn't formality on their expressions. It was fear. Emma purchased the portrait for $200, far more than the disinterested estate seller had expected. Back in her Cambridge apartment, she set up her examination station. High-resolution scanner, magnifying lamps, reference books stacked within reach. The sisters' faces seemed to watch her as she worked their eyes, following her movements across the room. The high-resolution scan revealed details invisible to the naked eye. The figure in the mirror became clearer. A man in a dark coat, his face turned slightly away, posture tense, predatory. The object in his hand appeared metallic with a distinctive, curved handle. Emma's stomach tightened. It could have been a surgical instrument or a weapon. Turning her attention to the photographer's mark, Emma discovered Crawford Studios had been a prestigious establishment in Boston's Back Bay, catering to wealthy families who could afford formal portraits. She cross-referenced historical directories, checking addresses and dates. The studio operated from 1885 to 1891, then abruptly closed. Kong loi gyaitich nao trong ho, so chi kon mot muk kwoi kong, trong dan bathant po, Roy Im Lang. Identifying the sisters proved even harder. Their clothing suggested upper-middle-class status, expensive fabrics, meticulously tailored, dresses, the fashionable bustle style of the late 1880s. The older sister wore a cameo brooch at her throat. The younger displayed a delicate chain bracelet on her left wrist. Emma photographed every detail, then began scouring historical newspaper archives starting with March 1889, searching for society announcements, engagement notices, anything that might identify the two sisters together. Hours passed. Her coffee grew cold. Outside afternoon faded into evening, yet she continued. Then just before midnight, she found it a small obituary, dated April 15, 1889, exactly 3 weeks after the photograph's stamp date. Elizabeth Caroline, 24, beloved daughter of the late merchant Jonathan, had died at home following a tragic accident, survived by her sister Sarah. The Boston Public Library archive room was silent, save for the whisper of old paper and Emma's careful breathing. She had requested every newspaper from April 1889 now spread before her like pieces of a puzzle, yet refusing to form a complete picture. The obituary for Elizabeth was brief and deliberately vague. Tragic accident at home. No details, no explanation. Emma had seen enough Victorian death notices to know this was unusual. When young women from prominent families died, the papers typically offered more illness. Carriage accidents, complications from childbirth. The studied vagueness suggested something the family wanted hidden. Emma continued searching and found a longer article 3 days after the obituary buried on page 7 of the Boston Daily Globe. Mystery surrounds death of society woman. The reporter had managed to extract a few more details from anonymous sources. Elizabeth had been found at the bottom of the stairs in her family's Beacon Hill townhouse. Her neck was broken. The family physician, Dr. Marcus Webb, had signed the death certificate, ruling it an accidental fall, but neighbors reported hearing raised voices that evening. Elizabeth's sister Sarah had been in the house at the time, though she claimed to be in her room unaware of anything amiss until the housekeeper's screams brought her running. Emma photographed every article, then moved to city directories and property records. The family had lived at 42 Mount Vernon Street, one of Boston's most prestigious addresses. The house was sold in 1890, a year after Elizabeth's death. Sarah had moved to a modest apartment in the South End. The dramatic change in circumstances was telling. Emma pulled out the photograph again, studying Sarah's face with new intensity. The younger sister, the survivor. Those wide, frightened eyes now seemed to hold secrets rather than innocence. Banco the Tuhoy. What could those eyes have witnessed on that fateful night? Emma stood outside the brownstone at 42 Mount Vernon Street, comparing the current building with a photograph from 1889 she had found in the Historical Society archives. The structure remained largely unchanged, same steep front steps, same iron railings, the same narrow windows, looking out onto the brick sidewalk. Somewhere behind those walls, Elizabeth had died. But first, Emma needed to understand the photograph itself. She returned to her research, focusing on Crawford Studios and its mysterious closure in 1891. At the Massachusetts Historical Society, she found a reference to James Crawford in a Photography Guild newsletter. Our colleague's sudden departure from Boston remains unexplained. His studio closed without notice in June 1891, and he has not responded to correspondence. What? The word departure felt deliberately euphemistic. Emma requested police records from 1891. What she found sent chills down her spine. James Crawford had been reported missing on June 3, 1891, exactly 2 years and 3 months after photographing Elizabeth and Sarah. The police report was frustratingly brief. Crawford had failed to open his studio one Monday morning. His assistant, entering with a spare key, found the dark room in disarray. Chemicals, spilled glass plates shattered across the floor. Crawford's coat and hat still hung on their hooks. His wallet lay in his desk drawer untouched. He had simply vanished. No body, no witnesses. The case went cold, filed away as one of many unexplained disappearances in a growing industrial city, where some people sometimes chose to start over elsewhere. But Emma knew better. She pulled out the photograph, staring at the figure in the mirror. Had Crawford seen something while developing this image? Had he noticed, as Emma had, that someone else was in the room who shouldn't have been there? Banco de Tohoy? Who was that figure, and why was he captured only in the mirror's reflection? The pattern emerged slowly, but once Emma saw it, she couldn't unsee it. She expanded her search beyond Elizabeth, examining other deaths and disappearances linked to 42 Mount Vernon Street. What she uncovered was disturbing. Between 1886 and 1889, 5 young women had vanished from the neighborhood. All were domestic servants. All had worked at one time or another for families on Mount Vernon Street or nearby blocks. The police reports were dismissive. Servants were transient, officers noted. They moved from position to position, sometimes leaving the city entirely without notice. Their families, often poor immigrants, lacked the resources or social standing to demand thorough investigations. But Emma noticed something the police had missed. 3 of the 5 women had worked directly in the house at number 42, employed by Elizabeth and Sarah's family, before their father died in 1887. One name appeared repeatedly in the records: Detective Patrick O'Brien, who had investigated 2 of the disappearances. Unlike his colleagues, O'Brien seemed to take the cases seriously. His reports were detailed, methodical. He interviewed neighbors, checked employment records, traced the women's final known movements. Emma traced O'Brien's descendants through genealogy records. His great-grandson, Michael O'Brien, was a retired police officer living in Dorchester. When Emma called and explained her research, there was a long pause. "My great-grandfather kept personal files," Michael said finally. "Cases that bothered him, ones he felt never got proper resolution. I have some of his papers in my attic. You should come look at them." 2 days later, Emma sat in Michael's living room, trembling as she opened a leather portfolio labeled Mount Vernon Street Case. Private. Inside were newspaper clippings, handwritten notes, photographs, and a list of names: 8 women, not 5. Detective O'Brien's handwriting was neat, methodical, each entry dated and cross-referenced. Emma could almost hear his voice in the careful observations. Nobody cares when poor girls disappear, but somebody should. The portfolio contained far more than official police reports. Detective O'Brien had conducted his own investigation, apparently on his own time. He had interviewed the families of the missing women, documenting their testimonies in meticulous detail. Each woman had last been seen in the vicinity of Beacon Hill. Each had mentioned being offered better employment, higher wages. Several had told family members they were meeting someone about a special position in a wealthy household. None were ever seen again. O'Brien had developed a theory, one he clearly never put in official reports. Emma found it on a separate sheet, dated November 1889, 7 months after Elizabeth's death. The disappearances stopped after the incident at 42 Mount Vernon Street. He'd written, "Elizabeth died in April. The last missing woman, Mary Sullivan, vanished in March." Coincidence. He had drawn connections between the missing women and the household. 3 had worked there as maids. 2 others had interviewed for positions, but were told the family wasn't hiring after all. Another had worked for a neighbor and had been seen speaking with someone from number 42 on the street. O'Brien had attempted to interview Sarah after Elizabeth's death, but she refused. Her lawyer sent a formal letter instructing the detective to cease harassing the grieving young woman. After that, the investigation stalled, but O'Brien had kept watching. Emma discovered surveillance notes spanning months who visited the house when lights were on, when Sarah left and returned. And then in June 1889, just 2 months after Elizabeth's death, Sarah moved out suddenly. On the final page of the portfolio was a name Emma hadn't expected: James Crawford, photographer. He had approached O'Brien regarding observations at 42 Mount Vernon Street. He seemed nervous, claimed to know nothing. We'll follow up. The next entry dated June 5th, 1891, Crawford missing. Coincidence. Sarah had vanished into obscurity after leaving Mount Vernon Street, but Emma was determined to follow her trail. The 1890 City Directory listed a Sarah living at a boarding house on Columbus Avenue in the South End, a dramatic decline from Beacon Hill prestige. Emma visited the location, now a renovated apartment building, and then turned to census records and Historical Society archives. The 1890 census confirmed it. Sarah, age 22, occupation listed as seamstress, living alone. Emma felt the weight of that fall from a wealthy household, with servants, to working with her own hands to survive. Ban ko tu hoi. What could have caused such a drastic shift in her life? The answer came from an unexpected source. At the Boston Athenaeum, Emma discovered a collection of personal letters donated by a prominent family. Buried within the correspondence was a letter dated May 1889, 1 month after Elizabeth's death. It was from a Mrs. Elalina Richmond to her sister in New York. The scandal on Mount Vernon Street has the neighborhood in an uproar. Poor Elizabeth is dead, and now terrible whispers surround the family. Sarah has been quite shunned by society. I heard she tried to attend the Winthrop reception last week and was turned away at the door. Some say she knows more about her sister's death than she told the police. Others speak of darker things: missing servants, strange occurrences in that house when their father was alive. The family's reputation is in ruins. Emma's hands trembled as she photographed the letter. Sarah hadn't just moved out, she had been expelled from her social circle, her name tainted by association with whatever had happened at 42 Mount Vernon Street. But there was more. Emma found a marriage record from 1893. Sarah had married a factory worker named Thomas Bennett. They had 2 children. Emma traced the lineage forward through births, deaths, and marriages right up to the present day. Sarah's great-great-granddaughter was alive, living in Salem. Her name was Catherine Howard, 67 years old. Emma made the call. Catherine Howard's house in Salem was filled with antiques and family photographs spanning generations. She welcomed Emma with cautious curiosity, setting tea on the coffee table between them. You said on the phone this was about my great-great-grandmother Sarah, Catherine began. I don't know much about her. The family never talked about that part of our history. Emma placed the 1889 photograph on the table. Catherine leaned forward, studying the 2 women's faces, and something in her expression shifted, recognition perhaps, or pain. I've never seen this before, she said quietly. But I know who they are. Sarah and Elizabeth, the sisters. Emma asked, what did your family tell you about them? Catherine was silent for a long moment, fingers tracing the edge of the photograph. When I was young, maybe 10 or 11, I found my grandmother crying in the attic. She was holding a letter, very old, yellowed. When I asked what was wrong, she said she'd learned something terrible about her grandmother Sarah, something that had been hidden for decades. Emma leaned forward. What was it? My grandmother wouldn't tell me the details, Catherine whispered. She said I was too young, but she told me Sarah had kept a journal And when she died in 1934, she left instructions that it should be burned. My great-grandmother couldn't do it. She hid it instead, and it passed down through the family. Each generation was told the same thing: don't read it. Don't speak of it. Keep the secret buried. Do you have it? Emma's voice was barely a whisper. Catherine stood and walked to an old secretary desk in the corner. From a locked drawer, she removed a small leather-bound book, its pages yellow and brittle with age. I read it once 5 years ago after my mother died. I couldn't sleep for weeks afterward. She handed it to Emma. Maybe it's time someone did something with the truth. Emma opened the journal with trembling hands. Wako hoi vantreo, lolung trong hong, ki what secrets had Sarah hidden in that journal, and what horrors might it finally reveal about 42 Mount Vernon Street.